He was 18 years old, and the state told him he was finally free. They gave him a cardboard box with 2 changes of clothes, a worn paperback, and an envelope containing a bus ticket and a deed to a piece of land he hadn't seen since he was 5. They said his grandfather's property was worthless, a forgotten patch of rock and pine in the middle of nowhere. But what he found there would change everything. If you've ever been told you're on your own, that what you have isn't enough, then you know the feeling I had that day. Stick with me and maybe even subscribe, because this story is for anyone who's ever had to dig for the truth. The freedom they talked about felt a lot like being thrown out. For 13 years, the foster care system had been my world. A series of houses, a revolving door of faces, and the constant low hum of not belonging. My 18th birthday wasn't a celebration. It was an expiration date. My caseworker, Ms. Gable, a woman permanently weary from the sheer weight of institutional paperwork, handed me the envelope with a sigh that seemed to carry the sorrows of every kid she'd ever processed. "Leo," she said, not unkindly, "this is it. The bus leaves at 6. The deed is for your grandfather's place up in Northwood. It's not much, but it's yours." I remember the feel of that envelope. It was thin, flimsy, like the promises that had defined my life. "What about anything else?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I didn't know what I was asking for. A phone number? A piece of advice? A reason to believe this wasn't just another form of abandonment. She gave me a sad smile. "The law says you're an adult now. You've got a roof over your head, legally speaking. That's more than some get." And that was that. The door to the group home clicked shut behind me, a sound of finality that echoed in the cold November air. The bus ride was a long, rumbling journey from the gray concrete of the city to the stark white of the northern country. I watched the world blur past the grimy window, my reflection a ghostly silhouette against the dying light. I saw strip malls give way to farmland, farmland to dense forest, and finally, forest to snow-covered wilderness. The bus wheezed to a stop at a crossroads with a single blinking yellow light and a gas station whose pumps looked like they'd been rusting since the last century. "Northwood," the driver grunted, not even looking at me. I stepped out into a cold that was sharper and more personal than any city cold I'd ever known. It bit at my cheeks and stole the air from my lungs. The gas station attendant, a man with a beard like a bundle of steel wool, just pointed a thumb down a narrow, unplowed road when I showed him the address on the deed. "About 2 miles that way. Old Joe's place. Hasn't been anyone up there in years." 2 miles. My jacket was thin, my boots were worn, and the box in my arms felt heavier with every step. The snow crunched under my feet, the only sound in a world that seemed to have been muffled by a thick white blanket. The trees, heavy with snow, loomed over the road like silent, ancient guardians. By the time I saw it, the sun was a pale, defeated smear on the horizon. The cabin was smaller than I remembered from my fractured childhood memories. It was more of a shack, really, hunched under the weight of the snow on its sagging roof. The windows were dark, hollow eyes. A crooked porch held a single, lonely chair, half buried in a drift. Worthless. The word echoed in my head. They were right. This wasn't an inheritance. It was a ruin. It was the physical manifestation of my entire life, neglected, forgotten, and falling apart. My hand trembled as I fished the key from the envelope. It was an old iron key, heavy and ornate. It felt ancient, like it belonged to a castle, not this dilapidated shack. For a moment, I just stood there, the key cold against my palm, the silence of the woods pressing in on me. A part of me wanted to turn around, to walk back to that lonely crossroads and stick out my thumb, to go anywhere but here. But where would I go? Back to a system that had just spit me out? I had nowhere else. This was it. This was my rock bottom, and it had a front door. With a deep breath that plumed white in the freezing air, I jammed the key into the lock. The mechanism was stiff from years of disuse and cold. It took all my strength, a painful, grinding turn, before I heard a loud, resonant click that sounded like a bone snapping. The door groaned open on rusted hinges, revealing a darkness that smelled of dust, damp wood, and the ghosts of 1,000 cold winters. I stepped across the threshold, from the biting cold outside to the still suffocating cold within. The door swung shut behind me with a mournful thud, and I was alone. Truly alone, for the first time in my life, in a place that was supposed to be my home. The darkness inside the cabin was absolute. I fumbled along the wall, my fingers brushing against rough, splintered wood, searching for a light switch. My hand found one, a brittle plastic toggle. I flipped it. Nothing. I flipped it again and again, the useless clicks punctuating the heavy silence. Of course, the power was off. It had probably been off for a decade. I set my box down on the floor and pulled out the small, cheap flashlight Ms. Gable had insisted I take. Its beam was weak, a pathetic spear of yellow light that barely pushed back the shadows. It revealed a single room. A stone fireplace stood cold and black against one wall, a gaping maw filled with old ashes. A simple wooden table and 2 chairs sat in the center, shrouded in a thin layer of dust that looked like a layer of fine gray snow. A cot was pushed against the far wall, its thin mattress stained and sagging. In the corner, a small kitchenette area with a hand-pump sink and a few bare cupboards. It was a study in abandonment. Everything was coated in the same uniform layer of grime and neglect. I ran a finger across the tabletop, leaving a clean streak in the dust. My grandfather, Joe. I tried to summon a clear memory of him, but all I got were flashes. A big, calloused hand holding mine. The scent of pine needles and sawdust. A low, rumbling laugh. He'd been my whole world until he wasn't. They told me he got sick, that his mind started to go, and he couldn't take care of a 5-year-old boy anymore. He'd died in a state facility a few years after they took me. That was the story I was given. Another flimsy envelope of facts with all the important parts missing. I swept the flashlight beam across the room again, and it landed on something on the table. Another envelope, thicker than the one I'd been given. It was propped up against a dusty jam jar. My name, Leo, was written on the front, in a shaky but determined hand. My heart hammered against my ribs. I walked over to the table, my boots echoing on the wooden floorboards. I picked it up. The paper was crisp, expensive. It had the letterhead of a law firm, Davies, Finch, and Associates. I tore it open, my cold, numbed fingers clumsy. Inside was a letter, professionally typed, and a cashier's check. I read the letter under the weak beam of my flashlight. It was from a Mr. Davies. He introduced himself as a legal representative for a company called Apex Holdings, a real estate development corporation. He offered his condolences on my grandfather's passing, a gesture that felt as cold and hollow as the cabin itself. Then he got to the point. Apex Holdings was acquiring land in the area for a large-scale resort project. They had already purchased all the surrounding properties. My grandfather's parcel, the letter explained, was geologically insignificant and commercially non-viable. It was, in essence, worthless. However, out of a sense of corporate goodwill and a desire to help a young man in my unfortunate circumstances, Apex was prepared to offer a one-time payment of $5,000 for the deed. The check was enclosed. All I had to do was sign the enclosed transfer agreement and mail it back in the prepaid envelope. The offer was valid for 30 days. $5,000. To me, it might as well have been $1 million. It was more money than I had ever seen in my life. It was a bus ticket to somewhere warm. It was a security deposit on an apartment. It was a way out. A clean break from this cold, dead place and the ghosts that haunted it. It was the easy answer, the smart move. The system had taught me to take the easy answers, to not ask too many questions. I looked at the check. It was real, crisp and official. Then I looked around the cabin again. At the cold fireplace, the dusty furniture, the sagging cot. Worthless. Geologically insignificant. The words felt like a judgment, not just on the land, but on my grandfather, on me. It was all we had left, this scrap of forgotten earth, and even that was being dismissed as trash. A wave of something I couldn't name washed over me. It wasn't just sadness, it was a stubborn, quiet anger. This place, this ruin, was the only thing that connected me to my family, to a life before the system. And this company, this Mr. Davies, wanted to sweep it away for pocket change, dressing it up as charity. I crumpled the letter in my fist. I let the check fall to the dusty table. I wasn't going to sign anything, not yet. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew I wouldn't find it by running away. I was going to stay. I was going to make this place my own, if only for a little while. I had to know what I was giving up before I let it go. That night, I didn't even try to sleep on the cot. I found a pile of old, musty blankets in a wooden chest at the foot of the bed. I wrapped myself in them, sat in one of the dusty chairs, and watched the feeble beam of my flashlight trace patterns on the ceiling until it flickered and died, leaving me in the profound, consuming darkness of the North Wood. The first few days were a blur of survival. The cold was a living thing, a predator that was always at the door. My first priority was fire. I spent hours gathering dry wood from a leaning shed out back, my hands raw and stiff. The fireplace flue was choked with old nests and soot, and it took me the better part of a day with a long branch to clear it. When I finally struck a match and the kindling caught, the first curl of smoke that went up the chimney instead of into the room felt like a monumental victory. The fire didn't make the cabin warm, not really, but it created a small bubble of life in the center of the room, a place to thaw my fingers and watch the dancing flames. The hand pump at the sink, to my astonishment, still worked. After a few minutes of frantic, squeaking pumps, it coughed up a stream of rusty, sputtering water that eventually ran clear and tasted of cold, clean earth. I had a small bag of non-perishables from the group home, enough for a week if I was careful. I ate cold beans out of a can, huddled by the fire, feeling less like a homeowner and more like a castaway. During the day, I worked. I swept away the thickest layers of dust. I scrubbed the table. I beat the dust out of the old mattress and blankets. Each small act of cleaning felt like an act of defiance, of reclamation. I was pushing back against the years of neglect, carving out a space for myself. It was on the third day, while sweeping near the fireplace, that I found the first inconsistency. The floorboards in the rest of the cabin were wide, rough-hewn planks, all running in the same direction. But in the small section near the hearth, one board was different. It was slightly shorter, and the wood grain didn't quite match. It was subtle, something you would only notice if you were on your hands and knees, looking for every last speck of dust. Curiosity got the better of me. I knelt down and pressed on it. It had a slight give, a tiny squeak that the others didn't. My heart started to beat a little faster. I didn't have any tools, so I used the tire iron I'd found in the shed. I wedged the flattened end into the seam and pried. The wood groaned in protest. Old nails screeched as they were pulled from their long slumber. The board popped up with a sudden crack. Beneath it was not the dirt foundation I expected, but a dark, hollow space. I shone my new, more powerful flashlight, purchased with a few dollars on a long trek back to the gas station convenience store, into the hole. The beam landed on a rectangular object wrapped in oilcloth. It was a metal box, about the size of a shoebox, secured with a heavy-duty padlock. My breath hitched. This was something hidden, deliberately. This wasn't just a forgotten item, it was a secret. I lifted the box out. It was heavy, solid. The padlock was thick and rusted, and I knew instantly that the old iron key to the cabin wouldn't work. For a moment, I felt a surge of frustration. A locked box holding who knows what, and I had no way to open it. But then that stubborn anger returned. This was a puzzle left by my grandfather, and I was going to solve it. I took the box back to the table, my mind racing. What could be inside? Money? Old photos? Something that explained why he let them take me away? The mystery of it was a spark in the cold emptiness of the cabin. It was a purpose. I spent the next hour ransacking the shed, looking for anything that could break the lock. I found a rusted handsaw, a hammer with a cracked handle, and a heavy-duty crowbar. The crowbar was my best bet. I wedged its tip into the hasp of the padlock and threw all my weight into it. The metal shrieked. I strained, my muscles burning, the cold air rasping in my throat. For a long minute, nothing happened, and then, with a deafening crack, the metal hasp snapped. The lock fell to the floor with a clang that echoed in the quiet room. I paused, my heart pounding, my hands shaking. I took a deep breath and slowly, carefully, lifted the lid of the box. The contents were neatly arranged. On top was a thick, sealed envelope with my name on it, again in that familiar, shaky script. Beneath it, bundled in twine, were stacks of cash, $100 bills. I counted it, my hands trembling so hard I could barely separate the notes. $10,000. It was double what Apex Holdings had offered me for the entire property. I sank into a chair, stunned into silence. $10,000 hidden under the floor. This wasn't the act of a man who had nothing. This was the act of a man who was planning, hiding, protecting. My grandfather wasn't just a sad story of a man who lost his mind. He was more complicated than that. He was a man with secrets. I picked up the envelope. It was sealed with a wax stamp, an intricate design of a pine tree. I broke the seal and pulled out a single, folded sheet of paper. The note was short, its message cryptic. "Leo," it began, "if you're reading this, it means you stayed. It means you have my stubbornness in your bones. Good, you'll need it. The money is for supplies, to get you through the winter. But it's not the inheritance. The real inheritance is buried deeper. The cold keeps secrets. Remember the old root cellar. Your future is under the ground. Stay warm, stay smart. Don't trust anyone who offers you an easy way out. Love, Joe. The cold keeps secrets. The old root cellar. Vague memories surface. A dark, sloping door behind the cabin. A place he'd told me to stay away from, saying it was full of spiders. I hadn't thought about it in years. My future is under the ground. What did that mean? The letter from Apex, the $10,000 in cash, the cryptic note. The pieces were starting to form a picture, but I couldn't yet see the whole image. All I knew was that the official story was a lie. My grandfather hadn't forgotten me. He had prepared for me. This wasn't just a worthless piece of land. It was a test, a legacy, and I had only just begun to uncover it. The next morning, I woke with a renewed sense of purpose. The fire was embers, but for the first time, the cold in the cabin didn't feel oppressive. It felt like a challenge. I ate, restocked the fire, and then, bundled in every layer I owned, I went outside. The world was pristine, covered in a fresh layer of overnight snow. I walked around to the back of the cabin, my boots sinking deep, and there it was, exactly where the ghost of a memory had placed it. A pair of heavy, slanted wooden doors, almost completely buried in a snowdrift. The root cellar. It took me over an hour to clear the snow away with a rusted shovel from the shed. The wood of the doors was dark, weathered, and swollen with moisture. A thick iron hasp held them together, but there was no padlock. Instead, a heavy iron ring served as a handle. I braced myself, grabbed the ring with both hands, and pulled. The doors didn't budge. They were frozen solid, fused to the frame by years of ice and neglect. I pulled again, grunting with the effort, my feet slipping in the snow. Nothing. It felt like trying to lift the earth itself. I thought about giving up, about waiting for a thaw that might not come for months. But my grandfather's words echoed in my head. You have my stubbornness in your bones. I went back to the shed and got the crowbar. I hammered it into the seam between the two doors, chipping away at the ice. I worked methodically, sweat freezing on my forehead despite the frigid air. Little by little, I created a gap. I jammed the crowbar in deeper and threw my whole body against it. There was a loud crack, like a gunshot in the silent woods, as the ice seal broke. The doors shifted. Hope surged through me. I pulled on the iron ring again, and this time, with a deep, groaning protest, one of an ancient thing being disturbed, the heavy door lifted a few inches. I propped it open with a log and then worked on the other. A few minutes later, both doors were open, revealing a set of steep stone steps leading down into a pitch-black darkness that smelled of damp earth and cold stone. It was a descent into the unknown. And this is a moment I want to pause on, because we all have them. That moment you're standing at the edge of something terrifying. A new job, a difficult conversation, or, in my case, a dark hole in the ground. You have a choice. Turn back to what's known, or step into the darkness, trusting that there's something on the other side worth finding. If you've ever stood at a threshold like that, I want you to let me know in the comments. Tell me your story, because this community is built on the shared courage it takes to take that next step. Now, back to the cellar. I stood there for a long time, peering into the abyss. The flashlight beam was swallowed by the darkness just a few feet down. Every instinct screamed at me to close the doors, to take the $10,000 and disappear. This felt dangerous. This felt like disturbing a grave. But my grandfather's note wasn't a suggestion. It was a map. Your future is under the ground. I took a deep breath, the icy air searing my lungs, and I took the first step down. The stone was slick with condensation. I held the wall for balance, moving slowly, deliberately. The air grew colder, heavier. The smell of earth more intense. 10 steps down, I reached a packed dirt floor. I swept the flashlight beam around. It wasn't a root cellar. Not just a root cellar, anyway. The space was larger than the cabin above it, maybe 25 by 25 feet. The walls were reinforced with thick wooden beams. Shelves lined one wall, but they weren't filled with dusty jars of preserves. They were filled with tools, neatly organized. Saws, drills, welding equipment. On another wall was a large workbench, with schematics and maps pinned above it, covered in my grandfather's handwriting. In the center of the room was a large wood-burning stove, a stack of firewood neatly piled beside it. This wasn't a cellar. It was a workshop, a hidden command center. My light fell on something else against the far wall. It was a heavy, military-grade steel locker, the kind you see in old army barracks. And next to it, a small desk and a chair. On the desk was a thick, leather-bound journal. I walked over, my footsteps unnaturally loud in the subterranean silence. The journal was open to the first page. The writing was the same as on the notes, but stronger, more fluid. "My dearest Leo," it began, "I hope to God you never have to read this. I hope I can tell you all of it myself one day. But if the world is as cruel as I fear, and if I am gone, then this book will have to speak for me. The story they told you is a lie, all of it. I didn't abandon you. I sent you away to protect you, and to protect this land." I sank into the chair, my legs suddenly weak. The air in the bunker was still and cold, but my mind was on fire. I turned the page and began to read the story of my grandfather, Joe, and the secret he died to protect. For the next several hours, I sat in that cold, underground room, illuminated by the single beam of my flashlight, and read. The journal was a detailed account of the last 10 years of my grandfather's life. It was a story of deception, of a quiet, brilliant man fighting a silent war against a faceless corporation. He wrote that he had always known there was something special about this land. His own father had talked about it. Strange geological formations, water that tasted of minerals. Joe was a self-taught geologist, a hobby he'd pursued with a passion his whole life. About 10 years ago, using old equipment he'd bought at surplus auctions, he'd started taking core samples. What he found was staggering. Deep beneath the worthless rock and pine was a massive deposit of coltan, a rare and incredibly valuable mineral essential for making electronics. It wasn't geologically insignificant. It was a treasure trove, potentially worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He knew, he wrote, that a discovery like that wouldn't bring peace. It would bring predators. And he was right. Shortly after his discovery, a company called Apex Holdings started buying up land in the area. They were quiet about it, using different shell corporations, offering just enough to convince the locals to sell their old family properties. They presented themselves as developers building a ski resort, a story everyone believed. But my grandfather knew better. He saw their survey teams using ground-penetrating radar, and he knew they weren't looking for the best place to build a ski lift. They were hunting for his secret. He tried to register his claim legally, but he was stonewalled at every turn. Clerks lost his paperwork. Applications were denied for mysterious reasons. He realized Apex had people on the inside, greasing the wheels of bureaucracy. They knew something was there, and they were isolating him, boxing him in, waiting for him to break. That's when the harassment started. Surveyors accidentally trespassing on his property, legal notices about zoning violations that didn't exist, low-flying helicopters buzzing the cabin at all hours. They were trying to intimidate him, to wear him down, to make him sell for pennies on the dollar. He knew they were watching him. He knew he couldn't fight them in the open. He was one old man against a corporate giant. And he had me, a 5-year-old boy, to protect. His journal entries from this period were filled with anguish. "How can I keep him safe?" he wrote. "If they know I have a grandson, they'll see him as a weakness, a point of leverage. They could try to get custody, declare me an unfit guardian. They have the money and the lawyers to do it." That's when he made the hardest decision of his life. He had to disappear in plain sight. He started to play the part of a crazy old hermit. He let the property fall into disrepair. He told wild stories in town. He started selling off his equipment, making a show of being broke. And then, the final, heartbreaking piece of his plan. He contacted social services himself. He told them he was losing his mind, that he couldn't care for his grandson anymore. He faked the early signs of dementia, a performance so convincing that the doctors and social workers all signed off on it. "Letting that woman lead you to her car was like cutting out my own heart with a rusty spoon," he wrote, and the page was stained with what I knew were his tears. "You looked back at me, your eyes so confused and sad. I wanted to scream, to tell them all it was a lie, to hold you and never let you go. But I had to be strong. I had to let you go to save you. They put you in the system, and I knew you'd be safe there, anonymous, lost in the bureaucracy, safer than you would be with me. They put me in a state facility, and I let them. It was the perfect cover. The crazy old man was out of the way. Apex thought they had won. They thought all they had to do was wait for me to die, and the worthless land would fall into their hands. He didn't stay in the facility. After a year, he used what little money he had left to bribe an orderly and simply walked away. He came back here to the cabin, but he lived like a ghost. He never went to town. He lived off the grid, surviving on what he could hunt and grow. And he worked. He built this bunker, this hidden workshop where he could continue his real work in secret. He spent years meticulously gathering evidence against Apex Holdings. The steel locker held the fruits of that labor. I put down the journal, my hands shaking, my vision blurred with tears. I cried. I cried for the little boy who thought he'd been abandoned. I cried for the grandfather who had sacrificed everything, his home, his reputation, his freedom, his only family, to protect a future he would never see. He wasn't a crazy old man. He was a warrior, a quiet, brilliant, stubborn warrior who had fought a dragon and won, even in death. His love for me wasn't absent. It was in every beam of this bunker, every tool on the wall, every word on the page. It was the fiercest, most painful kind of love I could imagine. After a while, the tears subsided, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I stood up and walked to the steel locker. Taped to the front was another small envelope. Inside was a key. It slid into the lock with a smooth, satisfying click. I swung the heavy door open. It was an archive of his war. There were binders filled with geological survey data, the results of his core samples, with detailed mineralogical breakdowns and estimated valuations that ran into 9 figures. There were audio recordings. He had secretly recorded conversations with Apex representatives who had tried to threaten or bribe him. Their condescending, predatory voices filled the silent bunker, as I played one on a small, battery-powered tape recorder he'd left on the desk. There were sworn affidavits from 2 former Apex employees, whistleblowers he had tracked down, detailing the company's illegal tactics of corporate espionage and bribery. And finally, there was a will, a proper, legally drafted last will and testament, leaving everything to me, Leo, his grandson. It was notarized and dated just a few months before his actual death from a heart attack, which the journal confirmed had happened right here, in this bunker, his secret sanctuary. He had died fighting. I sat there for hours, absorbing it all. The scope of his planning, his foresight, was breathtaking. He hadn't just left me a fortune, he'd left me a weapon. He'd armed me with the truth. The $5,000 offer from Mr. Davies wasn't an act of charity. It was the final move in a decade-long con, an attempt to swindle the orphan heir they assumed was ignorant and desperate. They had underestimated my grandfather, and now they were underestimating me. The fear I had felt for my entire life, the fear of being alone and powerless, was gone. It had been burned away by the righteous fire of my grandfather's legacy. I wasn't just the last of my line. I was the culmination of his fight. I knew what I had to do. I packed up the most critical evidence, the geological surveys, the audio tapes, the affidavits, and the will. I left the bunker, securing the hidden doors behind me. I walked back into the cabin, which no longer felt like a ruin, but a fortress. The letter from Mr. Davies was still on the table. I picked it up, my hands no longer trembling. I found a pen in one of my grandfather's desk drawers and wrote a simple message on the back of his generous offer. Not for sale. Then I walked the 2 miles back to the crossroads. I used some of the cash my grandfather had left me to buy a bus ticket back to the city. But I wasn't running away. I was going to war. The city felt different this time. It wasn't a place of anonymous despair anymore. It was a battlefield. I spent 2 days in the public library, using their computers to research law firms. I wasn't looking for the biggest or the most expensive. I was looking for a bulldog, someone who specialized in fighting corporate corruption, someone who took on impossible cases. I found her on the 3rd page of my search results. Her name was Evelyn Albright. Her firm was small, just her and a paralegal, located in a modest office above a bookstore. Her website was filled with testimonials from small landowners, environmental groups, and ordinary people who had been wronged by powerful corporations. I called her office and made an appointment. Walking into her office, I felt like a kid again, small and out of my depth. I was an 18-year-old in a worn jacket, carrying a backpack filled with evidence that sounded like something out of a movie. I was half convinced she would laugh me out of the room. Ms. Albright was a woman in her 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She listened to my story without interruption, her expression unreadable. I laid out the binders, the tapes, the will. I told her everything, my voice steady, fueled by a conviction I didn't know I possessed. When I was finished, the room was silent. She leaned back in her chair, tapping a pen against her chin. She looked from the evidence on her desk to me. "They think you're just a kid," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "They think you're a loose end they can tie up for $5,000 and a pat on the head." She stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the street below. Apex Holdings has a reputation. They're ruthless. They bury people in legal fees and paperwork until they give up. She turned back to me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of a smile on her face. It was a predator's smile. "But they've never come up against evidence this comprehensive. Your grandfather wasn't just a geologist, Leo. He was a master strategist. He's handed us a loaded gun." She walked back to her desk and sat down, leaning forward. "This won't be easy. They will fight dirty. They will try to discredit you, to discredit your grandfather. They will try to drown us. But I will take your case. We'll file an injunction to stop any sale or transfer of the property. And then we will sue them for harassment, conspiracy to defraud, and punitive damages. We will not settle for a quiet payoff. We will expose them. For the first time since I stepped off that bus in Northwood, I didn't feel alone. I had an ally. The war my grandfather started, we were going to finish. The next 6 months were a crash course in the brutal mechanics of the legal system. Apex Holdings responded to our lawsuit with a storm of motions and counterclaims. Their lawyers, a team of sleek, expensive men in $1,000 suits, tried every trick in the book. They claimed my grandfather was mentally incompetent, that his will was invalid. They claimed his geological data was fabricated. They filed motions to have the evidence thrown out, claiming it was illegally obtained. It was exactly as Ms. Albright had predicted. They were trying to bleed me dry, emotionally and financially. But they didn't know about the $10,000 my grandfather had left me, which I used for living expenses, or about the fact that Ms. Albright had taken the case on contingency. And they didn't know about the fire my grandfather had lit inside me. During the depositions, they tried to twist my life story into a weapon against me. Mr. Novak, their lead attorney, a man named Sterling, said with a condescending sneer, "You've spent your entire life as a ward of the state. You have no formal education beyond high school. How can you possibly understand the complexities of a geological survey?" I met his gaze, my heart pounding, but my voice was calm. "I understand what it means to have something taken from you, and I understand what's in these binders. It's the truth, and my grandfather taught me that's worth more than all the complexities in the world." The turning point came when Ms. Albright played the audio tapes in a pre-trial hearing. The judge, a stern, older woman, listened intently as the recorded voice of Apex's regional director openly threatened my grandfather. "Sign the papers, old man," the voice on the tape snarled, "or we'll find a way to take it. We always do." The courtroom was silent. Mr. Sterling's face went pale. They had assumed we were bluffing. They never imagined an old man in a shack in the woods could have been so cunning. The whistleblowers my grandfather had found agreed to testify. Their sworn statements corroborated everything. The case against Apex was no longer just a nuisance lawsuit from an orphan. It was an ironclad case of systemic corporate malfeasance. The day before the trial was set to begin, they folded. Mr. Davies, the man who had sent the original letter, called Mrs. Albright's office. He sounded very different from the condescending lawyer I had imagined. He sounded terrified. Their offer was astronomical. A settlement that would not only pay me the full, independently assessed value of the mineral rights, a sum that made my head spin, but also included a massive punitive damage award and a public apology for their campaign of harassment against my grandfather. It also included a condition that all evidence be sealed. Ms. Albright presented the offer to me in her office. "It's more money than you could spend in 10 lifetimes, Leo," she said, her voice neutral. "You could walk away from all of this right now and never have to think about Apex Holdings again." I looked out the window at the city bustling below. I thought about the easy way out, the $5,000 check. This was just a bigger version of the same choice. Take the money and run. But it was never just about the money. It was about my grandfather's name. It was about the truth. "No," I said, turning back to her. "No deal. We don't seal the evidence. They don't get to bury what they did. I want the world to know who Joe Novak was. And I want the world to know who they are." Ms. Albright's smile returned, wider this time. I was hoping you'd say that. We countered. We would accept the financial settlement, but the evidence would not be sealed. The affidavits and a summary of the case would be made public. Apex, facing a public relations nightmare and likely criminal charges, had no choice but to agree. The news broke a week later. The story of the old man who outsmarted a billion-dollar corporation was picked up by national news outlets. My grandfather was no longer a crazy hermit. He was a folk hero, a symbol of quiet resistance against corporate greed. His name was cleared. His legacy was secure. I didn't stay in the city. After the settlement was finalized, I went back to Northwood, back to the cabin. I used a portion of the money to have the property properly cared for. I had the cabin restored, not modernized. I wanted it to look just as it did when my grandfather was alive, only now it was warm and bright. The roof no longer sagged. The windows were new, but in the old style. The power was on. I hired a local crew, paying them well, and they treated the project with a kind of reverence. They had all known old Joe, and they were proud to be a part of restoring his home. I spent most of my time in the bunker. I converted it into a different kind of workshop. I established the Joe Novak Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to providing free legal aid to people fighting predatory corporations. The bunker, his secret command center, became the nerve center for dozens of new fights, funded by the very treasure he had died to protect. I didn't mind the land. The coltan could stay where it was, under the ground. Its value was greater as a shield, a resource to fund the foundation's work, than it ever would be as a commodity. The land's worth wasn't in the minerals, but in the principle it represented. Some things are not for sale. I'm telling you this story now from that cabin. The fire is crackling in the hearth. Outside, snow is falling, blanketing the world in a peaceful silence. It's no longer a lonely, cold place. It's a home. My home. It's a monument to a grandfather's love and a testament to the fact that one person's stubbornness can change the world. They told me this land was worthless. They told me I was alone. They were wrong on both counts. My inheritance wasn't the money, and it wasn't the minerals in the ground. It was the story I'm telling you right now. It was the discovery that the things that seem broken and abandoned can hold the most value. It was the understanding that home isn't a place you're given, but a place you fight for, a place you build. So what's the lesson here? It's that you should never accept the value someone else places on you, or on what you have. The world is full of people who will tell you something is worthless because they want it for themselves. Dig deeper. Look under the floorboards of your own life. You might be surprised by the secrets and the strength you find buried there. That is your true inheritance. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, if you've ever had to fight to be seen, to have your truth heard, then I hope you'll subscribe and become part of this community. Share your own story in the comments below. I read them, and they matter, because we're all in this together, just trying to find our way home.